Now, Tasmania is part of Australia, although of course it's a separate island to the south, but it's governed by Australia. This is the Tasman Bridge, which I use to get from this side of the Derwent River and round into the city, which is on the other side. And the city, usually in towns in Australia, are called the CBD, which is the Central Business District. This is Sammy. I hear you hold a world record. Can you tell me what it's for?
I do. I've made most coffees in 1 hour. Specifically the most cappuccinos in 1 hour, which was 353.
353 cappuccinos in 1 hour. When was that?
That was November 2 or 3 years ago now, I think.
Okay, and you still hold that record?
Yeah.
Wow, good. What's your name?
Sammy.
Sammy, well done,
Yeah,
Sammy.
thank
And
you.
did you raise money that day?
Yeah, definitely. We raised money for the Movember cause, so that's men's health.
Men's health.
Yeah, specifically prostate cancer, I believe is.
How much did you raise, you know?
It was over $1,000.
Well done.
So not a bad effort.
And she's making my coffee as well.
Certainly.
Brilliant. We are at the pinnacle of Mount Wellington, looking down on Hobart, Tasmania. Absolutely beautiful view. That's the bridge that I crossed earlier, if you can see it from here. And now that's obviously at sea level, and we're now at 1,270 metres above sea level. It's probably about 4,000 feet. Shortly I'll be mounting a bicycle and riding down the whole of the distance, 4,000 feet, 22 kilometres, down to sea level. That's the centre of Hobart. Well, that's the peak of the Mount Wellington, which we've come down to now. In Hobart, or in Tasmania, 1824. Unfortunately, it's not free beer. Well, good evening. This is my last night at Hobart. I'm in my room. I think it's about time that I introduce you to two friends of mine who've sustained me all the way through the 9 weeks. And here they are. They are the microwave steamer. This is it, the plastic microwave steamer, which I've used through the whole time. I've kept kosher by eating vegetables which I prepared and cooked them in here. The whole mix went in here and into the microwave. And that was supported by a small saucepan halfway through that somebody bought me, believe it or not, in a Secret Santa present. But that's been very useful for my cooking my corn on the cob and occasionally potatoes. And so the meal that it's actually prepared is just here for you now, and I'm about to eat it. I hope you can see it now. Here it is. I'll switch the camera. This is the meal I've been eating. So we've got cauliflower, we've got beans, we've got peas. We usually have carrots, but we haven't got any today. We've got cabbage, we've got garlic, we've got onions, and I've put a tin of sardines as well on top. Very delicious meal, and my corn on the cob is awaiting for me in the saucepan. So I'm very full when I've eaten it. I feel very satisfied. It's a very clean meal. For my last evening in Hobart in Tasmania, I've just taken a trip to a little pretty village which is just on the outskirts of Hobart, and discovered that this stone bridge is the oldest bridge in the whole of Tasmania and Australia. It was built in 1823, and it's a very pretty bridge indeed. Lovely evening, 25 degrees, just a very slight wind. It just makes a beautiful setting for a tranquil bridge like this. The bridge was actually built by convicts. There was a nearby, or probably a mile away, a stone quarry, and had to carve these stones by hand and carry them all the way to this bridge and built them. And there was a jailhouse situated here, very overcrowded, many of them in solitary confinement, and just like today, the prisons were totally overcrowded. The bridge had a function because in order to get to Hobart they had to cross this river, and so agricultural produce needed to be supplied to Hobart, and this bridge was an important artery. And the other thing about this river, it was called the Coal River because they actually discovered coal in the river, and so the area got that distinct name. Now going to the Richmond convict jail. You can see it's got a very unusual spelling. This was built to house the convicts that were transported from England. They had men and women in it. And this is the building that we're approaching now. And while we're approaching, I can tell you something more about the Schule in Hobart. Actually, the person who built it, I think is Judah Salomon, was a convict who paid for it all, and it was his land. And he'd somehow got a license to operate as a businessman. Judah Salomon somehow was a convict, but managed to get permission to trade and opened a business trading grain and selling grain overseas. He established such a successful business. He had a whole block of property in Hobart city centre. Obviously it was a lot smaller in those days, and when they came to establish the synagogue, he provided the land for it. And also when the ships came in with ballast, you know, to weight the ships down a bit because they came in empty to collect the grain, they then dumped the wood that was holding them, used as ballast, and he then got the wood and made seats and benches for the shul. Also, the convicts, Jewish convicts, were allowed to come to the shul services, and they had special convict benches, each with a seat number on the bench itself, where they had to sit at the back of the shul. The first governor wasn't really pro-Jewish at all, but the following governor was, and he allowed them to come on a regular basis. When the shul was open, he was unwell himself, but he sent his wife to the opening ceremony. Today the shul does not get a minyan on Shabbat, and probably lucky to get about 6 Orthodox people. They share the shul, Orthodox and progressives, and I think the early morning is the Orthodox, although they don't have a minyan, so they can't read the Torah. But the progressives who have the later minyan are not bothered about a minyan as such, as I understand it, and they certainly include women as being part of the minyan. And this coming Shabbat, they will have a minyan because there's a progressive rabbi coming to Hobart to conduct some kind of service, and I think baby naming. But it's very well preserved, and it shows that the enterprise of Jewish convicts was such that shuls were built. This was a convict pass issued in 1838 by the constable in Richmond. As you can see, even in those days they reused recycled paper. It was originally the Hobart Tower, but it's been named Richmond. He got a pass from the office, which meant he could leave and return the same day, probably to work for free for one of the villagers.